Today, we're going to focus on challenge, not the absence of data, but the moment where a decision has to be made before clarity is possible. Often the information exists, but it's partial, it's conflicting, it's time-bound, can be morally weighted. The defining issue is responsibility and timing over evidence. Yet we're sometimes forced to decide whilst we're standing right inside uncertainty, and that's not a comfortable place to be. In episode 3 of The Big Decision, we focus on deciding when information is incomplete. And one of the most uncomfortable truths about leadership is that the decisions that matter most are rarely made at the point where clarity arrives. They're sometimes required to be made well before that. They're made while information is still emerging or evolving, and while signals are mixed. Consequences are unevenly distributed, and the future remains stubbornly out of sight. This is not the same as deciding without data. It's deciding while the data is still forming and emerging, and while context is shifting. And all the meanwhile, we can't defer our responsibilities, and this is where many leaders struggle. It's not because they lack intelligence or diligence, it's because the conditions themselves are inherently unsettling, particularly in volatile market conditions. We're taught, often implicitly, that good decisions follow clarity, and that if we wait simply long enough and analyse carefully enough or ask enough questions, that the right path will reveal itself. In reality, leadership rarely works that way, and time extensions are not tolerated. So clarity usually follows commitment rather than the other way round, and we need to use emergent thinking and get comfortable with that. Information can be incomplete because the situation itself has not stabilised, particularly when we're dealing with things like a crisis. The decision is part of what shapes what becomes visible next. So I see this play out repeatedly with leaders who are facing time-bound decisions, and the costs of waiting can be as real as the risks of acting. So we're back again to commitment. So things like a contract renewal that must be agreed before all performance and cost data is in. Safeguarding decisions that can't wait for a perfect corroboration of the facts. Restructuring that has to begin where full or cultural impact can't be predicted. A leadership appointment where the future context tests qualities that have not yet been proven in that person's career history. And in those moments, leaders are not deciding with incomplete information, they're deciding despite it. So this is uncomfortable because it means accepting that uncertainty is not a temporary problem to be solved, it's a permanent condition to be carried. And this is why I would look at things in my corporate career like building flexibility into contracts, particularly when we're dealing with clients that were launching, maybe it's a new brand, a new product, through tools like scenario modelling, contract clauses like de maximis and de minimis, where we talk about ranges things may fall between, and review trigger points that happen when certain consequences land. And this is something I encourage my clients to think about. This moves the question from what is the right answer to what responsibility or perhaps cost am I willing to hold? And this is a very subtle but critical distinction. Decisions that are made under incomplete information can be framed as technical problems. They're rarely technical at heart. They're more usually ethical and relational. They can involve weighing who bears the risk now versus who bears it later, who absorbs the cost of that uncertainty or learning perhaps, as well as who pays the price if the decision or the cost model is wrong. What happens if we delay a project further or avoid completely to move forward? So flexibility in our approaches helps us to hold that reality. One of the reasons these decisions are so difficult is that they expose the absolute limits of rational optimization. There's not a simple calculation that will tell you how much uncertainty is acceptable. There isn't a spreadsheet that can quantify reputational damage, injury, or trust erosion in advance. We can try and assign values through things like risks and issues registers, but we do so knowing that they're representations and they're calculated estimates, not facts. So at this point, the judgment matters more than analysis. So let me tell you about a time I worked with a leader who was responsible for deciding whether to intervene in a failing part of the organisation, and performance data was mixed. Some of the KPIs suggested improvement and others suggested decline at the same time, so we had to hold two truths. Staff feedback was contradictory and actually probably more dependent on the staff's internal loyalties. Waiting did mean we might have some more better information, a little bit more clarity, but it also carried costs of potentially delayed revenues and lost opportunities. And the longer the decision was delayed, the more strain would be loaded onto the teams involved. So the leader's struggle was not about data, it was about timing. Intervening too early risked destabilising something that had the possibility of clear recovery. Going too late meant entrenched harm and a harder position to reverse and come back from. So what ultimately guided the decision was not certainty, but responsibility. And that was the recognition that doing nothing is a decision with its own consequences, and whether that was tolerable or not. And this is a theme that recurs again and again. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the cost if I do nothing? So leaders often tell themselves they're waiting for more information, when actually what they're waiting for is reassurance or rescue, somebody to take the decision away from them. And that very rarely arrives, because where is it going to come from? At some point, deciding under incomplete information means accepting you will not feel ready. The decision will not be perfect. And this is where many decision processes fail, because readiness is confused with correctness. Feeling ready is a psychological state. Being responsible is an ethical one. They're two very different things. And strong decision makers learn to distinguish between the two. They don't rush. However, they don't hide behind the idea of preparation when the conditions for clarity simply do not exist. There's an honesty and a truth to that. Another challenge in these situations is the presence of multiple and often competing narratives and interests. When information is incomplete, different people fill the gaps in different ways. Assumptions multiply, interpretations become taken as read, and stories take hold. In leadership settings, this can lead to polarisation. So one group argues for action, whilst another argues for restraint, sometimes in the same meeting room with the same facts before them. Each party believes they're being rational, and each side accuses the other of recklessness or avoidance, if not explicitly, certainly implicitly. And what is actually happening is that people are responding to the uncertainty they feel through different lenses of risk. Some are more attuned to the risk of acting, some to the risk of not acting. Neither perspective is wrong. However, without shared views, conversation becomes adversarial rather than deliberative. And that's where the role of the decision maker becomes one of containment, not of people, but of uncertainty. We must create enough psychological space for competing interpretations to be aired and shared without immediately collapsing into a vote, a compromise, or a forced consensus, or alternatively walking away declaring there is conflict. I've seen leaders try to resolve uncertainty by splitting the difference and making those partial decisions that look like movement but satisfy no one and solve nothing is not helpful. It can feel pragmatic, but it usually reflects discomfort with holding a clear line in ambiguous conditions. And usually 2 to 3 months later, people are back around the meeting room table, remaking the same decision. Deciding under incomplete information requires a different kind of courage. And that's the courage to say, this is what we know right now, and this is what we do not know, and this is what we're assuming, and this is what we're choosing to carry. And that kind of clarity doesn't eliminate disagreement, it invites instead reflection. It does make the decision and the impacts of the decision clearer, and this matters. When people understand the rationale behind a decision, even when they disagree with it, trust is more likely to hold in that decision. When decisions are opaque and not clear, confusion and resentment can fill the gaps with those left carrying the consequences. So this applies just as much to personal decisions as it does to organisational ones. Deciding whether to leave a role, to make a move, to commit to a path of action often happens before certainty is available. We tell ourselves we need more time, more insight, more evidence, when in reality, what we need is the willingness to act without guarantees. It's not about impulsivity. It's about recognising when the search for certainty has become a way of actually procrastinating and postponing the inevitable. One of the most important disciplines in these moments is separating the fear of being wrong from the fear of being accountable. Fear of being wrong is about ego, and fear of being accountable is about ethics. Good judgment doesn't eliminate the risk of being wrong. Those who can exercise good judgment accept the risk and still decide. And this is why leadership development that focuses solely on tools or frameworks or confidence completely misses the point. The hardest decisions are not technically complex. They are uncomfortable. And they ask you to ask yourself, who am I willing to be when clarity is not available to me? As this series has explored so far, decision quality is not about eliminating uncertainty. It's about how we personally relate to it. Deciding under incomplete information is not a failure of process. It's the condition under which leadership is actually truly exercised. And when leaders learn to name that condition honestly, to carry responsibility explicitly, and to communicate decisions with integrity rather than false certainty, something shifts in the organisation. People stop waiting for perfection. They stop demanding guarantees, and they begin to engage with reality as it actually is. That is not easy work, but it is the real work. And it is what distinguishes leadership that reacts from leadership that leads. In the next episode, we'll look at what pressure reveals about our decisions once they have been made, what becomes visible when systems are stressed, when comfort falls away, and when the consequences can't be deferred any longer. Because it is often in those moments that the deepest learning occurs, and whether we choose to see it or not. Thank you for listening to The Big Decision. Go and make great decisions.